Rome decided what was holy and what was heresy. The Vatican councils cut books out of Scripture. European kings and their armies enforced it with fire and blood. Jesuit priests marched into Ethiopia in the 1600s, forcing Emperor Susenyos to betray his own people and his own church. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Manuscripts were burned. Entire generations were told their Bible was illegal. But Ethiopia had the oldest canon in the Christian world, 81 books, not 66. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Meqabyan texts, writings that Europe erased because they exposed a history older than Rome, a history rooted in Africa. For centuries Western Christianity lied, teaching the world a shorter Bible, while monks in the mountains of Ethiopia risked death to guard the full truth. This is not just religion. This is colonization of the mind. This is cultural genocide carried out in the name of God. And tonight, we tear back the curtain. No filter, no excuses. So, if you are African and serious about truth, listen closely. Because this is the story of the forbidden Ethiopian Bible and why Europe tried to kill it. Kindly hit that like button and subscribe so more Africans can find this hidden truth. Now, let's go deeper. Long ago, in a place called Axum, a culture rose that kept a book language alive. The language is Ge'ez, the sacred tongue, the language of the church. Monks wrote on goatskin and parchment by dim light. They painted pages with bright pigments and with gold. Those books were not just stories, they were people's memories. Some of those manuscripts are among the oldest Christian books on earth. They include the Garima Gospels, which scholars date back many centuries, and they show that Ethiopian Christianity built its own library, built its own canon, its own heartbeat. The guardians of those books were not Western universities, they were monasteries, on cliff faces, men who lived both on prayer and ink, keeping pages safe while the rest of the world made other arrangements for what books would be sacred. Now listen to the single blunt fact that breaks the usual story. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church recognizes a Bible that is larger than the Bibles most of the world knows. It counts roughly 81 books. 46 in the Old Testament and 35 in the New Testament, making a total that does not fit neatly into what Rome or Geneva accepted. That number matters, because it shows Ethiopia kept texts the rest of Christendom had set aside. When the rest of the world narrowed their lists, Ethiopia kept a fuller library. The Ethiopian canon sits in the mountains, not in the councils of Europe. That is the technical line, but now the human line. Why did the rest of the Christian world push these books away, and why do some people say the Ethiopian Bible was banned? There are two things to understand, plain and powerful. First, many of the extra books are old, strange, and at times shocking. They talk about angels mating with humans, about giants walking the earth, about heavenly secrets that make some clergy uncomfortable. Second, the process of who decides what is scripture was not a neutral academic exercise. It was politics, empire, and clergy bargaining with kings and armies. We will unpack both sides. Let us begin with the books that get everyone shouting. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Meqabyan books are some of the texts that make the Ethiopian canon different. The Book of Enoch is famous for its vivid stories about angels and fallen watchers. In early Christian centuries many writers quoted from it, and fragments of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing it was not a random late book. Yet when the dominant churches in the Middle Ages drew their lists, Enoch did not make the cut. Those decisions were driven by questions about authorship, language, and theology. Is this book written by an apostle, or is it written later by someone using a famous name to gain authority, what scholars call pseudepigrapha? Does it fit the theology that church leaders want to teach, or does it pull believers toward a different spiritual imagination? These are the reasons most often given. They are scholarly reasons, but they also became tools for marginalizing books that did not fit the theological and political project of Western Christendom. History, however, does not end at argument and theology. It moves with swords and crowns. In the early 17th century, an episode happened in Ethiopia that shows how religion and force mixed to try to reshape a people. A group of Jesuit missionaries, backed by Portuguese interests, entered the Ethiopian court. A Spanish Jesuit named Pedro Paez and later a Portuguese patriarch named Afonso Mendes became central figures in a campaign to align Ethiopian Christianity with Rome. On the 11th of February 1626, Emperor Susenyos and Patriarch Mendes held a public ceremony that effectively acknowledged the primacy of Rome and made Catholic practice official for a time. Mendes moved to ban or condemn many local practices, and he tried to rewrite liturgy and behavior to fit Roman norms. The attempt to override Ethiopian Christianity produced resistance that exploded into rebellion and bloodshed. By 1632, the experiment had failed and the Jesuits were expelled from Ethiopia. This violent clash was not only about doctrine. It was an attempt to replace an African church authority with a European one, and it had consequences for how Ethiopian sacred books were treated and who got to define scripture. Here is the reality. When foreign missionaries and colonizers arrive with the attitude that their version of scripture is the standard, books that do not match their lists are at risk of being labeled as non-canonical or even dangerous. That does not mean every removal equaled a violent ban. Often the marginalization was bureaucratic, institutional, or academic. Books then became hidden when printing and translation projects favored the smaller Western list. For Ethiopia, this process was complicated by language. The church used Ge'ez, a language few Western scholars read for centuries. When translation into European tongues became the standard for scholarly access and for missionary instruction, the Ge'ez text remained in monasteries. That isolation looked like a ban to outsiders, and to Ethiopians it felt like being silenced. You need to hear some voices that lived this. The historian, Bruk Asale, in a detailed study of the Ethiopian Canon, warned that the list itself is obscure, and that the Church's idea of canon is not the same as the West's list. He writes that the notion of a closed or fixed list is alien to Ethiopian tradition, and that understanding what the Church calls sacred requires listening to how priests, monks, and scholars actually use their books. That is not a polite academic footnote. It is a testimony that the Ethiopian Church never lost the texts because of negligence. It held a different idea of Scripture, one that the West misread as disorder. Now let us bring this into sharper view with names, dates, and a quote. An early British scholar, A. Wallis Budge, who wrote about Ethiopia, described Patriarch Afonso Mendes as rigid, uncompromising, narrow-minded, and intolerant. That phrase is not speculation. It is Budge describing the mindset that helped push a foreign program into Ethiopian life. When Mendes condemned Saturday Sabbaths, frequent fasts, and local baptisms, and when he told women their children had been baptized in error, he helped create a crisis that turned into death and exile. Richard Pankhurst, another leading historian, recorded that up to 100,000 people in areas like Dembia and Wegera were reported to have converted during that tumult, sometimes under duress. Those are the hard numbers historians use to show how religion became a tool of power in that moment. Now back to the documents themselves, because the content matters. The Book of Jubilees rewrites Genesis into a calendar structure that strengthens Jewish legal memory. It was embraced in some early Jewish and Christian communities, but when the major councils of Europe were deciding scripture, Jubilee did not fit the narrative they wanted. The Meqabyan books, which appear in the Ethiopian Canon under a name similar to Maccabees but which are different in content, tell heroic stories with a particular Ethiopian resonance. These books matter because they show Ethiopia did not borrow a Western canon and transplant it. It built its library from its own story and memory. That independence threatened the ambitions of outside powers who saw religious conformity as political control. Let us also be clear about printing and translation, because this is where marginalization became a modern ban. Emperor Haile Selassie convened a Bible translation committee in the mid-20th century that produced an Amharic Bible in 1962. That edition included the narrower canon, translated from Ge'ez, while the fuller, broader set of books, the 81-book version, was not widely available in a single printed edition until later. In practice, the books that the Ethiopian Church considered sacred were often not printed in the mass market in Amharic, so for decades people outside Ethiopia and many inside the country had little access. This scarcity made it easy for Western scholars and churches to point at a lack of printed editions and call those books marginal or uncanonical. That is a kind of erasure that is slow and bureaucratic, but it produces a similar effect to a ban. When I say ban, hear me right, banned by whom? Sometimes there was no single order saying do not read these books. Often the ban was structural. Missionaries, colonial administrators, and foreign scholars promoted a smaller canon. Mission schools taught it, presses printed it. Local monasteries were left with the scrolls. That imbalance created a world where millions could say that the Ethiopian Bible had been banned because they could not access the texts that their ancestors called scripture. This is the moment to put two short testimonies on the table. First, Bruk Asale, the scholar we mentioned, after interviewing Ethiopian theologians, found that some argued that the canon is open, while some argued that it is closed, and many preferred to avoid the question. He wrote that, and I quote, "Which books comprise this list remains obscure." That line is a testimony from scholars who live inside the church. And it shows the canon is a living thing, not a closed museum piece. Second, Wallis Budge described Afonso Mendes with the harsh words we quoted. Those two lines together explain the clash. One side holds its living tradition loosely and broadly, the other side arrived rigid and eager to redraw boundaries. That collision left bodies on the ground and books locked away. You will hear online claims that the Ethiopian Bible was banned for 1,600 years, or that Rome hid it because it told secrets. Those are sensational headlines, and parts of them are borrowed from half-remembered facts. The safer, truer account is this: some books like Enoch were respected in early Christianity. Fragments have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, showing they were read and quoted. But when dominant councils shaped what would be taught in Western Christendom, they excluded many of these works for reasons that could be theological, linguistic, or political. Ethiopia kept them, the West mostly did not. That does not prove a single global conspiracy. It does show a long, messy history of exclusion and marginalization. If you want to call that a ban, understand the nuance. It was a ban by omission, by translation choices, and by the force of imperial power. Now I am going to slow down and tell a story, with precise names and a quote you must remember. In the 1620s, Patriarch Afonso Mendes tried to change Ethiopian practice, and he did not hide his contempt for local rights. Wallis Budge wrote that Mendes was rigid, uncompromising, narrow-minded, and intolerant. That attitude led to forced conversions, rebellion, and a breakdown of social order. On the 14th of June 1632, Emperor Susenyos rescinded his edict, proclaiming Catholicism as state religion, and his son Fasilides later exiled the Jesuits and closed the door to the forced Romanization of Ethiopia. That sequence, 1626 to 1632, is a blistering example of how power and scripture mix with blood. The scan of the events shows the mechanics of a ban practiced through politics and violence. I also want to name some of the books that get people's guards up. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, 1 Meqabyan, 2 Meqabyan, and 3 Meqabyan are part of the Ethiopian Old Testament. The New Testament lists include works such as the Synodos, the Books of Covenant, Ethiopic Clement, and others that some scholars place in a broader canon. These texts contain histories, laws, and liturgical material that do not sit neatly in the Western categories of biblical books. The Ethiopian Church developed a religious life that included these texts in worship and teaching, and that is a living fact that Western lists often ignore. Let us bring the sensory detail back, because this is not a museum. Imagine a scriptorium in the north of Ethiopia. The scribe sharpens a reed pen, presses it into soot and gum, and then breathes on the page. The smell of goat skin is strong. Outside the monastery, the wind takes the sound of prayer into the valley. At night, the monks fold pages and wrap them in leather. They bury scrolls in clay jars in the earth when danger comes. That is how these texts survived wars and missionaries. Modern scholars writing reports in sterile libraries rarely capture the smell of ink and dust that kept the books alive. But those are the very details that explain why texts persisted despite foreign pressure and why their marginalization felt like a theft. Museums and libraries have catalogs now, but for centuries the only audience for some books were the monks and elders of the church. Now, you need facts you can take to the street and say as truth. The Ethiopian Canon is distinct and large, typically counted at 81 books. The Haile Selassie Amharic Bible was printed in 1962 and included the narrower Canon, which reflects what had been most commonly used in liturgy and teaching. The full corpus of the broader Canon was not commonly printed in a single volume for mass distribution until later editions and projects in the 20th century. Scholars like Bruk and Asale have shown through interviews that the Church treats the idea of canon differently from Western churches, which helps explain why the books were marginalized rather than publicly affirmed or denied in the ways outsiders expected. Those are not conspiracy lines, they are academic findings, and they matter for understanding the real mechanism of marginalization. At this point you might be asking, is there a hidden truth in these books that powerful people want to bury? Perhaps a secret about Jesus, or a lost technology, maybe a map to some treasure. No, the books are not a single revelation that undermines everything. They are multiple witnesses, some ancient and weighty, some later and more local, which present a broader picture of faith in Africa. The danger, to the powers that be, was not in a single secret. The danger was in a living tradition that asserted an African center for scripture and history. That center refused to be reshaped on European terms. Over centuries, that refusal looked like an embarrassment to those who wanted a single European story of Christianity. So the books were sidelined, mocked, and sometimes called apocryphal, which in practice was an easy method for colonial and missionary institutions to delegitimize an African archive. The effect was the same as a ban in many practical ways. Let us also be brutally honest about the myths that spread on the internet. Videos and articles that yell about a global conspiracy to hide the Ethiopian Bible often confuse different things. They confuse the lack of Western acceptance with an active global ban. They mix centuries-old language barriers with deliberate suppression. There are no smoking gun documents from Rome that say burn the Ethiopian books. Instead, there was a messy process of exclusion, scholarly preference, and missionary power. That process created a kind of knowledge apartheid where texts in Ge'ez were sidelined because Europeans did not read Ge'ez or did not value African traditions. That is the truth. It is not romantic. It is not a blockbuster conspiracy. It is a structural failure that looks like a ban to those who lost access to their texts. This video also asks a moral question for us who are watching today. If Scripture was used as a weapon to reshape African churches, should not the memory of that be restored? Should not the books be translated and put back in the hands of the people whose lineage kept them? Preservation alone is not enough. The real repair is returning the text to the center of cultural life. In recent years, Ethiopian scholars and institutions have been doing exactly that. Manuscripts are being digitized, scriptoriums are being revived, and the language of Ge'ez is receiving renewed respect. This is not a quiet academic movement, it is a reclaiming of moral authority. Before we close, I will give you a final plain list of events and dates that matter. Emperor Susenyos publicly converted to Catholicism around 1622, and in a major act on the 11th of February 1626, he and Patriarch Afonso Mendes held a ceremony recognizing Rome, which led to unrest. By the 14th of June 1632, Susenyos rescinded his edict, and by 1633 and 1634, his son, Emperor Susenyos, expelled the Jesuits and reasserted Ethiopian Orthodox independence. The Haile Selassie Amharic Bible was published in 1962 with the narrower Canon. The broader, 81-book version was recognized in print in later projects, with the Ethiopian Church maintaining that its canonical tradition includes many books Western churches do not fold into their lists. These are the fixed points in a long, complicated story. Now I want to give you 3 straight takeaways you can use when you argue this on social media, at a kitchen table, or in a classroom. Number 1. The Ethiopian Bible was not a single secret that powerful men hid. The reality is more honest and more painful. Books were marginalized by language barriers, by colonial and missionary agendas, and by theological decisions made in different cultural contexts. That produced a system where certain books were made invisible to much of the world. Number 2. Ethiopia kept a living and different idea of what Scripture is. The Church used a broader set of texts in worship and teaching, and that living practice persisted despite outside pressure. That persistence is a claim to cultural autonomy, and it matters to Pan-African memory. Number 3. Recovery is happening, but it is not complete. Projects to catalog and translate G's manuscripts are ongoing. The world is finally paying attention, but the process must be led by Ethiopian scholars and by the communities who have held these books for centuries. If this video woke something in you, subscribe, like, and share. Tell a young person about the Garima Gospels. Tell a neighbor about the monks who hid books in caves. Tell the world that the story of Scripture is not a European story alone. Keep the conversation alive, and when you read your next Bible, remember that there are other books in other hands, and those hands are not empty. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.